Welcome to my new and improved bedroom. These are under the seawall stickers, which are covered everywhere in my room. The Etsy seller markets them to, 6-year-old boys, or rather I guess their mothers, but that didn't stop me. That's gonna be our background for this video, which I think is maybe not the most fun video, but at least I hope will be useful. So for myself, and I think many other transmasculine people, bleeding is something that is painful, it's inconvenient, and it makes us feel dysphoric, but unfortunately it's just a fact of life for a lot of us. I'm first going to talk about tips for making the experience of bleeding less dysphoric, more comfortable, all of that, and then I'm going to talk about ways that you can make it less likely that you bleed overall or entirely stop bleeding. So first of all, bleeding is the euphemism I choose to use. It's the one that makes me feel comfortable. That's that. I guess so first of all, there's sort of mental ways that you can, I think, recalibrate your thinking around what's going on. So I try to normalize the concept for myself and think of it as just one of many bodily functions. I think overall, bodies are weird, they do all sorts of weird things, and generally, I think that sort of bodily waste is not fun and it's not great. People have to deal with all sorts of weird things. Some people sort of have digestive issues that lead them to have to deal with diarrhea. People have issues around peeing. Sometimes you get sick and you have to blow your nose all the time. These are just not fun things. And bleeding is just one of many bodily functions that we just have to deal with as humans. So it doesn't need to be an inherently gendered experience, even if sometimes it feels like it's marketed towards us as that. It's just annoying, it's inconvenient, and it's part of what my body is doing because it's what my body's doing. So that's how I choose to think of it. Second of all, if you're assigned female at birth, you might bleed at some point again. You might think that you've stopped it forever because you've started testosterone, you've gone on birth control, you might bleed again. And generally, it's, I think, best to prepare for the possibility of bleeding when you are not currently bleeding. That means buying whatever products that you need when you don't need them at that moment. Because I think that when you wait till you're in that headspace of currently bleeding, you're in that most dysphoric, most painful headspace, it's like the worst time to have to go out and then approach the cashier with menstrual products. It's way better to do it when you're in a good headspace than when you can think calmly about things. And I'm giving that advice because that's some advice that I didn't take. I started testosterone over a year ago, and within a month or two, I had entirely stopped bleeding. I chose to throw out all my menstrual products, and I was like, I'll never bleed again. And then, things happen. I'm incredibly regular with my shot, but for some reason my levels just dipped low. So I had to boost the amount of testosterone I was doing every week, and we don't know why. It's just my body changed the way it processed testosterone. But yeah, after a year of being on testosterone, I noticed that I was spotting a little, and I had, again, already thrown out everything that would have been useful. But noticing that I was spotting, at that point I wouldn't have needed any products, but I could tell something was up. And instead of acknowledging that something was up, and contacting my doctor, buying some products in advance, I said, let's just ignore this. I can't deal with this. This is too hard. And I pushed it down the road. And that wasn't a great choice because at some point I really did need to deal with it and I had no game plan. I was in a terrible headspace and I had just pushed it off to the last moment. I am generally better prepared, and that's not something I'm going to do to my future self. And so I generally recommend, whether you're someone who bleeds regularly or irregularly, to stock up, make those decisions when you're not actually bleeding. And also, if you're hoping that you might never bleed again, maybe you won't. And that's great. Then you can be one of those cool guys that, that happens to carry around pads or tampons for your female friends. And that's awesome. That's a great separate role. And so I think there's no harm in being well prepared. My next tip is, in terms of things to do when you're actually bleeding, is that I'm a huge fan of these sort of period underwear things. And in particular, they make some sort of more masculine cuts to these period underwears. And I like that. I don't know. I find that to be the less dysphoric option for me. In particular, I have a brand recommendation. And so the way that these work is there's sort of a very absorbent lining underneath, and it's sort of plasticky. So if you are not bleeding heavily, you can go the entire day wearing them and you don't need to wear anything else. If you are, you can use it as a backup for another method you might have. The masculine cuts are often going to be called boy shorts or briefs because they're marketed towards women, and that's what they refer to boxers as, essentially, for women, as boy shorts. Okay, that's fine. So typically these period underwears are incredibly expensive. I had gotten some for free from my school once from Thinx, which is I think one of the most expensive brands, and they were great. But then I went to go look at repurchasing them, and the boy short cup was $40 or something, and I was like, that's crazy. So I have a recommendation that comes from Amazon, and this is great also because you can get that 2-day Amazon shipping. And so the brand is called Bam Body, I'm not really sure. And they look like this. And so they're the Bam Body boy shorts, and I'll put a link in the description. First of all, I'd recommend going a size up for two reasons. So one is that these just run a little short. But then second of all, if you're used to purchasing things in men's sizes, these are in women's sizes. And so I always get medium for men's boxers, and then I got medium for these. I should have gotten a large. They fit me, but they're just a little tight. And secondly, so on the Amazon page, they have these like incredibly feminine women wearing them in like a sexy way. It won't look like that on you. I don't think that I don't think I look like the Amazon figure. My next tip is that you should experiment with like all sorts of different types of menstrual products, because you don't know what will make you feel more or less dysphoric. And so obviously pads and tampons, but then there are also menstrual cups. Those didn't work for my anatomy, but I know that some people really love them. Something that you might struggle with if you typically wear men's underwear is that a lot of men's underwear is really not well equipped to fit pads. So I often wear boxer briefs, which will look like this. So they like have a space down here that is meant to hold a dick or a packer or whatever, and so there's just like an amount where it hangs loose, and the fact that the crotch hangs loose is not good for when you need to have a pad. So there are two options that you can do given that. The first is to instead get men's briefs, not boxer briefs. So briefs are meant to hold your junk like a lot closer to your body, and so they're a lot tighter, and so they look like this. So they're a lot tighter, and so those can actually hold a pad correctly. Or alternatively, you can do underwear that is like marketed in like women's cuts, but on top of it wear, say, a pair of boxers. So I really like these boxers from American Eagle, which are like flex boxers is how they call them, I believe. And so I like them because they're very like stretchy like this. They like do not like cling to your thighs, which I've had a problem with a lot of men's boxers doing. And so you can just wear whatever underwear underneath and then just put boxers on top. And then you don't need to think as much about like have that added layer of dysphoria of having to wear women's underwear. And so then there's also the question of like fully stopping bleeding. So with a lot of things, there's this debate about like learning to accept something versus just getting rid of it. And I think for a lot of transition-related concepts, people try to argue that like it's impossible to work through dysphoria and you absolutely like need to transition. I think those kind of arguments are a little bit counterproductive. I could have done fine without transitioning. I would have been less happy. And transition was like not hard, so I did it. My life is better. There was a time before medical transition existed where trans people could not medically transition, and you know, surely lives were a lot worse for a lot of those people, but most of them kept on living and lived otherwise adequate lives, just worse lives. I think the times where it makes sense to work on acceptance are when there is not a good option available. So like, for example, height dysphoria, right? There is not a surgery to change height. Like, I mean, there is, you can break all your bones and like extend the bones. It's terrible, it's dangerous, it's bad. So you have to like work on self-acceptance and learn to accept your height. You don't need to do that with voice, because that will just change. You don't need to do that with like facial hair stuff, because most people will get facial hair. You don't need to do that with your chest, because you can get top surgery, though you might have to do that self-acceptance work on having scars. And yeah, so you have to make that trade-off between, you know, how easy is the thing to change, and like how much better will your quality of life be if you change it. If it's impossible to change, then you gotta work on self-acceptance. So in this case, it is actually just possible to really decrease the amount that you bleed. I can suggest all those tips for like rethinking about the way you can conceptualize bleeding and ways to, you know, to deal with bleeding when it happens, but also, you know, like maybe just it's nice to not bleed. So one thing that obviously does decrease the extent to which you bleed is testosterone, but that isn't perfect for everyone. So for a lot of people, testosterone will stop your period, but you can look at a lot of videos on YouTube of trans guys or trans masculine people generally who've had their period come back after having been on testosterone for a long time. It might come back if you accidentally miss a shot, which happens, or if you're late on a shot, or like me, if your levels just dipped for some reason, or it could just happen randomly because like life is weird. But there's another option available to you, both to double up with if you're already medically transitioning, but also available to you if you're pre-transition, which is hormonal birth control. So I think a big misconception is that there's this idea that hormonal birth control will mess with the masculinizing effects of testosterone. And that's true for some forms of hormonal birth control, but not for others. So this information is coming from like a talk I had with my doctors. You should obviously have these talks with your doctors too, and maybe they'll say something different, and if they do, you should trust them. But this is what my doctors told me, which is that so typically there are two hormones that are used in hormonal birth control. One is estrogen and the other is progesterone. Estrogen might mess with the masculinizing effects of testosterone, and they don't like prescribing any forms of birth control that contain estrogen to trans masculine people. Progesterone won't. So there are lots of progesterone-only forms of birth control. These birth controls, if they're sort of applied continuously, will really radically decrease the extent to which you bleed. The three ones that were presented to me as options are the hormonal IUD, so the brand name for that is often the Mirena IUD. Then there's the hormonal birth control implant, which goes into your arm. That is known as the Nexplanon. And then there is the long-acting birth control shot, which is also progesterone only, which is called the Depo Provera shot, and you need to get one of those every 3 months. The IUD works, you have to go to the OBGYN. You don't need to be put under. In a relatively quick procedure, they will insert it like through your cervix, and it stays there for like 5 years. I had the IUD once. I got it back in the start of college, and it definitely did work to stop my bleeding. I was pre-testosterone, and I just said that I did not want to bleed anymore. So this is the great thing about these, right? Like, if you are closeted or pre-transition, or if you're someone who isn't sure about transition but knows that you really do not like bleeding, you can get these things. And you can view it as a start to your transition if you want, right? And it's also pretty easy to talk to your doctors or to your parents and to convince them to let you get these forms of hormonal birth control without having to explain that it's because of dysphoria. So in particular, the thing that you could say, which is what I said, is that bleeding is incredibly painful for you, that you have, that you have really bad symptoms associated with it, and that you really would like to not bleed. And that's incredibly common for a lot of AFAB people, and it very well might be true for you, right? Like, I think for most people it's not a pleasant experience. So you can go for the argument of explaining the reason why you want to get this as being due to the physical pain of it, and then you don't need to out yourself. That's why I got the IUD. The insertion was super, super painful, but largely because I didn't take any painkillers in advance. So if you're considering getting the IUD, I would recommend talking with your doctor about potentially taking painkillers in advance of the insertion. I just cramped a lot afterwards, but that, even though it was very painful, it was over in a day. And I had spotting for like a month, but then I didn't bleed thereafter for years. I had to get the IUD out before I froze my eggs, which I did before the start of my transition. Now that I have had the spotting come up again, I talked to my doctors again, and they presented me with those 3 options, and I decided I wanted to try one of them try the Depo Provera shot, because the shot you get every 3 months, and so if I didn't like it, I could stop after the first shot, and I didn't need to go again. But I've liked it. I've had a great experience. My bleeding has stopped, and I think that I'm going to get the Nexplanon Implant next time. So the implant goes into your arm, and then that lasts, I believe, also for 5 years, but for quite a long time. And so now that I know that I feel no symptoms of being on progesterone, and it is in fact stopping my bleeding, I'm ready to commit basically to the implant. And yeah, so these are options that, yeah, you can do pre-transition and view as sort of as a start to your transition, right, as ending something that makes you feel dysphoric, or you can do, if you're on testosterone and you get the effects of stopping bleeding, not risking bleeding if you forget your testosterone dose, and you also, of course, get the benefits in terms of contraception. If you're pre-testosterone and having sex in a way that could make you pregnant, you obviously need contraception. But if you're on testosterone, even if you are not bleeding regularly, you can still get pregnant. This is good both as a form of birth control and as a form of stopping bleeding. Yeah, so I would recommend looking into these things. Both, you have ways to manage dysphoria while you're bleeding, but you're not stuck forever. You don't always need to bleed, and you can really decrease the likelihood that you bleed by talking with your doctor and looking at these forms of hormonal birth control.